Micron is one of the 3 top memory makers in the world. 20 years ago, there are probably a dozen producers out there. In the US, there's only 1 Micron left. Outside the United States, there are 2 Korean guys, Samsung and Hynix. Now, the industry had really consolidated. The volatility with the cyclical industry become less cyclical, right? Because like the 3 guys are basically control 95% of the market, and they're becoming more rational. There's a new business segment, which is a small part within the overall DRAM. It's called high bandwidth memory. And this business, because it's so new and the market is growing so fast, the margin profile is a lot higher. And that makes the story a lot more interesting for this very traditional, very conventional cyclical industry. Micron's mission has always been, we are not planning to become #1 in terms of like a revenue size. All we do is trying to find our niche, to have the best low power product in the world, to keep our margin high, to keep our profit high, and generate free cash flow.
Welcome to Global Money Talk. I'm Dan Ha. Today I'm joined by Rob Lee, Managing Partner of Amman Partners, to discuss and learn about Micron technology. Rob, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.
Okay, so how long have you followed Micron?
You know, it's a cyclical stock, it's a cyclical industry, so we actually follow for a long time. You know, in my entire career in the public equity market in the last like 10 years.
Okay.
We follow it on and off, and we sometimes will go long about it, sometimes we'll short about it. We're engaged right now. We've been shareholders since 2022, so it's been for a while. Okay.
And what got you interested in the stock in the first place, or in the company?
You know, so I would say pre-ChatGPT and after ChatGPT, there's a different story. So pre-ChatGPT is really a cyclical industry and cyclical stock. What we like is really consolidation story of the cyclical industry. So Micron is one of the 3 top memory makers in the world. So they really do 2 parts of the traditional memory business. The first one, which is 2/3 of the business, what we call the DRAM, which is really the memory for compute. The other side of business, roughly 1/3, is called NAND business or flash drive business, whatever you call it. That's really for storage. When we talk about the memory for compute, that's really talking about when you go to final examination, you know, taking a math test, you got to clean your sheet of paper, you sketch out some like formula, draw some pictures, and after the test, you throw it away. You don't need it. It's really for that compute during your taking that examination. When we talk about storage in memory, that's really talking about, hey, I need to write down, you know, your wife's birthday, wedding anniversary, all of the important stuff you actually need for long-term memory. So that's the storage side of the business. Now, the industry had really consolidated in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, there are probably a dozen producers out there. Now it's really only 3. In the US, in this country, there's only 1 Micron left. Outside the United States, there are 2 Korean guys, Samsung and Hynix. And because of industry consolidation, the volatility with the cyclical industry become less cyclical, right? Because like the 3 guys are basically control 95% of the market, and they're becoming more rational. So starting in 2022, there's a big up cycle. Before that, since COVID, right? Because COVID, everybody started home, everybody buying a lot of computers, phones, because everybody is working remotely. So the demand for memory, remember, it applies to both compute and storage. That went up a lot, which is good for the entire industry. But starting in 2022, 2 years after COVID, that high start to fade, and suddenly people wake up and say, hey, there are too much PCs and smartphones out there, like we don't need that much. So you see a big inventory correction in 2022. And that's why, you know, makes the industry interesting, because when we see a down cycle, we're trying to get out the bottom. Because for a new up cycle, we started really mid-2023, you can make a lot of money, made a lot of profit from that. So that's really the first leg of the story, which makes us interesting, and we've gone through that up and down cycle in the last 10 years, 3 cycles. So we're pretty familiar with that. But towards the end of 2022 and 23, there's a new leg of thesis really starts to appear after ChatGPT, right? Which is AI. Now you might ask, like, how does AI apply to this space? Well, there's a new business segment, which is a small part within the overall DRAM. Remember we talked about the compute memory business. It's called high bandwidth memory. It's a small segment within the overall DRAM space. And before AI, before ChatGPT, there's really no use of that. So the way we think about it is like, think of the high bandwidth memory as like a huge blackboard. So pre-AI, when you do math calculation, 1 + 1 = 2, it's very easy calculation. So you don't need a huge blackboard to do it. It's like one small hand of size, your hand. You can just write down 1 + 1 = 2. Done. That's easy.
Yeah.
But in the AI age, like the computation is so complex. So yes, in theory, you can use GPU, very powerful GPU NVIDIA, to do the calculation. But there'll be 100 steps. So you need to write down the first step, wipe the blackboard, and write down the second step. And it's going to be 100 steps, which takes a lot of time. Now, high bandwidth memory, high bandwidth is basically a huge blackboard the size of this wall, right? So this very smart student, NVIDIA GPU, can write down the entire 100 steps in one shot, and then wipe it and go for the next problem. So that dramatically accelerates the entire process and saves a lot of time. And this is why this is a huge blackboard. Pre-AI, there's not much use. The product is there, but there's no application. But since AI, since ChatGPT, suddenly people will wake up and say, hey, there's a huge use for the huge blackboard. And that business basically went from zero, roughly in 2022, to this year, like 25, the industry expects the entire market to be 25 billion, from 0 to 25 billion in a couple of years, which is amazing. And this business, because it's so new and the market is growing so fast, the margin profile is a lot higher. And that makes the story a lot more interesting for this very traditional, very conventional supercritical industry. So this becomes a structural part of the news story. And so that's the second leg of thesis that make us become very interested, very attracted to play this space.
Got it. That's very helpful. Before we talk more about the future, let's actually go back in history a bit. So, tell us a bit about the history of the company, and focus please on sort of the founding idea of the company and why that was successful. And also, as the company evolved, what were some of the key defining moments for the company that kind of brought it to the Micron of today?
Yeah, so I would say Micron today versus Micron when we started like 40 years ago in the late 70s are completely different. And this tells you how much tech change was in the semiconductor industry over the last 40 years. When it first started, it really only does memory, really on the storage side. And then gradually through a lot of acquisitions and basically acquired the capability to do DRAM, which is memory for the compute side. And back in days when Intel was still the king of Silicon Valley, they actually co-developed a lot of the leading edge technology back then with Micron on the DRAM side. And that's why it became like one of the leading players within the DRAM space. And back in the days, we used to do a lot of stuff outside of memory. So they actually have a personal computer business, which now nobody heard of, because they eventually got rid of that business like after the internet bubble in early 2000s. So they decided to really focus since the internet bubble burst. It's like, look, if you want to do a personal computer business, compete with Dell, compete with HP, with IBM, we don't really have a unique advantage. Our unique advantage is really focus on the memory side and become a supplier to our end users and clients. And that's what they decide to focus on. So I would say that's probably the first defining moment. Then they decide to shrink the portfolio and really focus on memory product. And I would say the second phase, defining phase for the development, is really since the mobile started to take off, right? Okay. 07, iPhone pushed out, and everybody realized, okay, this is really the new thing. Now, remember, pre-iPhone, for your smartphone, well, it's really not smart. It's a dumb phone. They don't use a lot of memory because there's not a lot of calculation.
Right.
You just need to make a call, send a text. But with smartphone, suddenly this little machine in your hand can become actually as powerful or even more powerful than the computers. That requires not just a lot of storage memory, but also a lot of compute capability. Now remember, when you need the compute memory to support that compute. And so that's basically become the second driver for the business. At Micron, I wouldn't necessarily say they made a conscious choice to go after that, but they just got lucky. They happen to have a leading technology applies to very low power a DRAM or compute memory, and suddenly found a great use for phones, because phones, by definition, are small in size. They cannot carry like a huge battery.
Right.
So the power efficiency become a very, very important for that overall market. And Micron will come and say, well, sounds like we are the best guy because our product, which is low power, happen to have a very good use for smartphone. And that's why they had a big push and won a lot of market share within the smartphone market. So like even today, if you look at the flagship models like iPhones like i5, 15 Pro, 16 Pro, and even Samsung, which is a major competitor, also does their flagship phone. They all use Micron's low power DRAM memory because they have an edge there. So I would say that's really the second phase. And the third phase, again, really comes to the AI age, which is very recent. It's really less than 2 years.
Yeah. That's very helpful overview. How has the competitive landscape evolved over that same period? And what does that competitive landscape look like today? Earlier, you mentioned how the industry has consolidated a lot over time. So take us back to that same point where you started with Micron's history. What did the competitive landscape look like then, and how did that evolve?
Yeah, so let's break it down from conventional versus like the AI-related high bandwidth memory business.
Yeah.
So we only look at the conventional. It's very much like every other cyclical industry, go through massive industry consolidation. Again, 20 years ago, there's like probably a dozen players out there. And now there's only really 3 control of 95% of the market. China have their own players, but they only supply to domestic market. So external market is really completely dominated by 3 players only: Micron, Samsung, and Hynix. And the reason the market consolidates is again, it's not different from any other cyclical industries. When the industry upturn, everybody's happy, everybody's making a lot of money, so a lot of small players decide to come in. But when the industry goes through a downturn, and remember, this is very capex-heavy industry. Typically, the capex intensity is roughly 30%, meaning you sell $100 of product, you need to spend $30 to $35 to reinvest in capex to maintain that economy of scale. And when there's a downturn, the margin can be very, very negative. Not just like -1 or -5. The margin can be negative like 20, 30%. So every time the industry goes through a downturn, a lot of small players will simply just go belly up, go bankrupt, or they got swallowed up by the big players. So in the last 20 years, we probably went through like 6 or 7 times these like up and down cycles. Really every 2 years, there's like industry up or down cycle. And so it's through this like natural selection process, there's only 3 guys left. And right now, like Micron's actually the smallest guy, right? Micron roughly have 25% of the overall conventional memory business. Samsung, is like slightly below 50%. Number 2 is Hynix. But now there's only 3 guys left, and there's only 1 US company left. The consolidation story pretty much all done. This is it. It's unlikely that Samsung or Hynix can buy Micron, or Micron can combine with one of the Korean guys for national security reasons.
Yeah.
So now the industry become a lot more stable and a lot more, the competition is still there, it's still very intense, but versus like 10 or 20 years ago, the competitive pressure is a lot more rational. Because nobody want to kill, because they know nobody can really die out of the big 3.
Yeah.
So that's really on the conventional side. Now on the high bandwidth memory side, the memory catering to the AI space, it's very new. So, then again, only 3 guys can do it. The Chinese players, they cannot even do the high end for the conventional side, let alone the AI memory side. So really only 3 guys are doing that. And the competition there right now, I think, is still very muted, because really it's only Samsung trying to get into space, but they don't have a viable product yet. They're still going through qualification with NVIDIA, but they have not secured the qualification yet. So there's only 2 suppliers on the table right now: Hynix, which is bigger, and Micron. And because demand is so high, much higher than supply right now, there's really no competition for now. Eventually, the competition will show up. Samsung eventually will qualify for NVIDIA, and 5, 6 years from now, maybe some new players, including Chinese players, might enter the market. But for now, it's really a two-player market, and with very favorable supply-demand trends for the suppliers. So this competition for now on the AI high bandwidth memory side is fairly muted.
Yeah. I do want to come back to the competitive landscape of the future. But before we do that, Micron ended up being one of the last ones standing, right? What did they do right that allowed them to be one of the last ones standing?
So number one is like continue to innovate, because like how do you win in commodity market? Nobody can win because by definition, if you're selling commodity product, your chip, your memory chip, and everybody else's memory chip the same. Then the only way to compete is on price or is on scale, like who has the lowest cost. So to win that game, to be differentiated, you need to innovate. And again, going back to their advantage in terms of like a power efficiency, that has always been the core of Micron. And they got roots in there, and they continue to really push on that advantage to all their suites of different products, including the high bandwidth memory side, which is now they do have an edge over the competition, Hynix in terms of power efficiency. So I would say that's one big thing. The next thing I would say, over the past 25 years, and it's not just to Micron, but to the other the big two Korean guys as well, is everybody learned the story that the boom times don't last forever. So management from all three companies become more disciplined. So when things are good, they don't really spend too much capex to flood the market with products and just kill everyone else. Again, they become more rational. So when things are good, they do step on the gas pedal, increase their capex a little bit, but not to that extent that was like 20 years ago. It was like so intense, and that helped everybody. Because when the downturn comes, yes, it's painful. You're losing money, but the downturn is much shorter versus the last few cycles, versus like 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Got it.
So I would say innovation and that increased capital discipline really helped them.
So that's how they became one of the last ones standing, but they did allow Samsung and Hynix to surpass it. How did they let that happen?
So I would say Micron took a very different approach. Micron's mission has always been we are not planning to become number one in terms of like a revenue size. All we do is trying to find our niche to have the best low power product in the world, to keep our margin high, to keep our profit high, and generate free cash flow. Like market share is not necessarily our game. Our game is as long as we keep our fair share of market share, they always target between 20 to 25%. That's good enough for them. So they're really focused on more on cash flow generation and margin protection versus market share gain, which is slightly different from how Samsung thinks about this. But remember, Samsung is a conglomerate. Samsung not just does memory. Samsung has a lot of different business. Versus like Micron, this is the only thing they do. Remember, they sold their personal device business like 20 years ago. This is the only thing they do. So their approach is more different. They're more focused.
And the fact that this very cyclical business is the only thing that they do hasn't been a disadvantage for the company.
Well, for the industry, everybody like suffers during the downturn. The good things like again, when you only have three guys out there, you sort of like become a more oligopolies, because like all three guys know if we do something aggressive, irrational, that's bad for our competition, but also that's bad for myself. And that's why you see over the years, all three companies, there's no overt coordination, but they become more rational. Like to give you an example, like very recent example, in the last quarter, on the storage memory side business, the NAND, there's like a inventory correction short term on the PC smartphone side. You see immediately all three players start cutting capex immediately. Micron announced they're cutting 20% capex there, capacity there. Hynix announced they're cutting 17%. Samsung hasn't formally made an announcement, but they're cutting back their capex and capacity as well. So like there's no overt coordination, but you see all three guys respond to that inventory correction very quickly. And this, we definitely did not see that 10 years ago.
Got it. How do you assess Micron's competitive advantage now?
So, again, separate from the conventional memory side versus AI memory side. Conventional side, again, their advantage really on the innovation on the low power side, and also in terms of node evolution, meaning they have a more efficient process to jam more units of memory into a set amount of like a chip or square. So that basically increases the density for a memory product, which is good for the clients. So Micron is the first one out of the three to move to 1 beta process, which is the leading way of manufacturing and packaging these memory products. So they moved to that, over 50% of their processors are in 1 beta mode, and they crossed the threshold in summer of last year. So the first one, way ahead of like Samsung and Hynix. So that's very important. Now on the AI side, again, they apply their know-how, their roots, their advantage in the low power side to high bandwidth memory side. So when you talk to, and they claim and get verified by NVIDIA is that, yes, they have the same high bandwidth memory, the 3.5 generation is called 3E, was Hynix, but they have 30% lower power consumption, the same product versus like Hynix product. So that's they're basically transferring what they know, what they learn, working on the conventional memory side to the AI memory side. And remember, power consumption is very, very important for AI because everybody's running a lot of Microsoft or Amazon or Google running huge clusters of the AI servers. They consume a ton of energy, and that's a big thing. Because 70% of the operating cost running the AI centers are really for power. So if you can cut your power consumption by 30%, that's a major, major benefit to the end clients, and that gives them, a durable advantage going forward.
And how do you see? Earlier, you talked about how for now there isn't new competition, but you did say that over time that might change. So how do you see that playing out? If this is truly a durable competitive advantage, why would that erode away even with time?
Yeah, so first let's talk about the big three. For now, there's only two, as we mentioned before, there's only 2 suppliers, Hynix and Samsung. Hynix is actually the tech leader when it comes to this. They're actually the first to push out, mass produce the 3.5 generation, the 3E high bandwidth memory product, the last quarter. So 4Q of 2024. Micron actually started mass producing this quarter in 1Q of 25. So 1 quarter behind Hynix, even though their products are 30% more power efficient. Samsung, remember, has not qualified, but we do expect Samsung will qualify because the biggest client, which is NVIDIA, from the client perspective, obviously you want 3 suppliers versus 2 suppliers. Because the more suppliers you have, the more diversified your supply base is, it's safer for you. And also you have more room to negotiate better pricing. So NVIDIA right now is actually really actively helping Samsung to get them to qualify. They really want them to get it qualified. And we do expect, not this quarter, maybe next quarter, maybe second half of this year, eventually Samsung will get qualified. And when they get qualified, sure, will the competition be, will the pricing, we don't necessarily think there'll be pricing pressure, but as all 3 players sort of expand capacity into 2026 and 2027, when the supplies start to catch up to demand, then there could be more pricing pressure for sure there. Now, this really regarding the 3 major players who count already on the past producing AI memory. Out of the 3, the only viable outside suppliers really are the Chinese guys because they can always do the conventional side. Now, the major hurdle for the Chinese players to manufacture high bandwidth memory is really they don't have the tools, or the United States and the Western world severely restricted equipment sales to the Chinese players.
Right.
So they don't have the really necessarily tools to manufacture high bandwidth memory. For example, for high bandwidth memory, you need the most advanced EUV machine from ASML.
Right.
But for now, China are not supposed to get SML machines, so it makes it very, very tough for them to enter this new space. Now, could that change in the future? Not in the next year or two, but maybe 4 or 5 years down the road, when China have a better relationship with the United States, which is a possibility, the restriction could be relaxed against China, and they could now source all the equipment from the Japanese suppliers, from the Dutch suppliers, from SML, and then they have the tools, and given enough time, then there's a chance they could get there. But that's more longer term. It's definitely not medium term. So that's definitely a risk, long-term risk. But for now, we think the risk for short to medium term, the risk is pretty low. That's more like for beyond 5 years.
Got it. How do you see government policy sort of playing into the future and the future competitive advantage of Micron? As we know, back in the 80s, what the U.S. government did to sort of block Japanese competition was helpful for Micron, but it also gave rise to the Korean players. So how do you see the government policies playing out, and how would that impact the competitive advantage of Micron?
So I would say, for now, the government policy was beneficial to Micron. Really, two things. Number one, the restrictions and the equipment, advanced equipment exports to Chinese players, and I feel that could be stayed for quite a while. That's definitely helpful, not just for Micron, but for the other two South Korean players as well. That's number one. Number two, because Micron is the only U.S. memory producer left in the entire world, so they actually got a lot of subsidy to expand their capacity and their research and development capability right here in the United States. I'm sure our audience read the news that they got roughly $6 billion to expand their capacity right here in the state, in New York, in upstate New York. Now, obviously, that's take a long time. That's when that new plant started operational, that's probably beyond 2027. So it's a couple of years down the road. But they're definitely getting subsidy, but more really to expand the production capacity here, because United States government, be it Biden administration or Trump administration, one of their key asks is to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. The reshoring theme, right? So that's very helpful for Micron, because most of their advanced packaging facilities production are still outside the United States right now, in Southeast Asia, in Taiwan, and Japan.
Even for Micron?
Even for Micron.
Got it. How do you see that playing out? I think it's interesting that Morris Chang, even though TSMC is definitely expanding and building here in the States, have expressed sort of doubts of success of moving production, advanced production to the United States. So do you think we have what it takes to produce here, or how do you see that playing out?
So that's very interesting debate right now. There's a lot of doubters about as you mentioned, the TSML plant in Arizona, but there's actually news coming out just in recent months that they're actually getting better margin here in the U.S. versus Taiwan, because labor cost is indeed a lot higher, but everything else, especially power utility, is actually a lot lower versus in the plants in Asia. The same thing will apply to Micron as well. Without government subsidy, I would say the cost here will be slightly more expensive versus their Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and Japan plant. But with government subsidy, I think they actually have a clear path towards parity in terms of the cost. And that's why they're actually very excited about doing that. The key advantage from the U.S., aside from labor, there's simply no way for U.S. labor to match the labor costs in, outside the United States, especially in Asia. But everything else, utility, power, water, everything's actually a lot cheaper here. The huge advantage of the U.S. U.S. is net energy producer, and that's massively beneficial to basically any manufacturing business. And remember, right now, there was a new administration coming in. the market is now expecting more deregulation when it comes to nuclear power. Historically, nuclear power has very slow progress here. It's because there's it's sort of very long and tedious EPA process to pass the environmental testing qualification before it can do that. If the new administration decides to relax on that, you could see there's a more push and more faster growth from nuclear power. And remember, that's a lot cheaper. Yeah. That's a lot cheaper than conventional energy. So that could be additional upside.
Got it. So what are some of the key investor debates today? Sort of the bullish arguments and the bearish arguments.
Yeah, so we sort of touched upon on those debates a little bit. Again, first on the conventional side, the debate's really on, yes, there's inventory correction going on in PC and smartphone, and the bears think, okay, that's not like a one quarter thing. The companies, Micron, say, hey, look, we think they'll end by spring of this year. The bears will say, no, this is going to last throughout 2025. This is like a structural thing. The Chinese guys going to start, get into the latest generation conventional DRAM, and that's going to basically kill the pricing for everyone. So that's the debate on the conventional side. Now, on the AI memory side, I think you already brought a very good point, which is number one, when will Samsung qualify? When Samsung qualify, become the third supplier, will that destroy pricing? Number two, after Samsung qualifies, when will we see the outside players, the Chinese guys, get into the space? Could be this year or next year or 2 years from now. And when they show up, what's going to do to the new business, which carries much higher pricing and much higher profitability versus conventional product. So those are, we'll say, the debates on the conventional memory side and on the AI memory side right now.
I want to get your thoughts on the valuation of the stock, but before we do that, I just want to get your general take on sort of the state of the Chinese sort of homegrown, home-developed semiconductor industry. I think it's fair to say that most people are doubtful, but what's your experience? What's your view? How advanced are they? So please share your thoughts.
Yeah, so we touched upon this a little bit on the AI memory side, so we're going to focus on the conventional side right now. So the conventional memory side, we're going through transition from DDR4, the fourth generation, to the fifth generation DDR5. Micron happened to be the first one to cross the 50% threshold made last year. So right now, the fourth generation is only less than 10% of the overall conventional memory pie. Yeah. For Samsung Hynix, they're roughly mid-teen, but they're closer to 10% and single digit. So now majority of what they do is really on the latest generation, DDR5. And we're moving to DDR6 next year. Majority of what Chinese players doing are still DDR4. Now they're doing lab scale, not huge scale DDR5, and there's a lot of suspicions, and a lot of bears saying, oh, they're going to DDR5 this year. We're going to disrupt everybody. We actually have a slightly different view. We think they can do DDR5 if they don't care about yield. But for this product to be commercially viable, that's to be very difficult. And again, it goes back to the manufacturing process or equipment. Right now, the Chinese players, from a pure lab scale perspective, yes, they can do fifth generation. How they do it? They're using 28 nanometer process, which is a very old tech, to manufacturing that. Now, yes, you can do that with old tech, but the downside is you're going to sacrifice on your yield. So, what we hear from the Chinese players or contacts in China, they're getting yield single digit, less than 10%.
Okay.
So basically, you're manufacturing 100 units of the product, only less than 10, single digit, can be used, which destroys your margin. Meaning, the more you sell, the more money you're going to lose. Now, if you're doing something super high tech and doesn't require a lot of volume, then fine. The Beijing, the government can just give them a lot of subsidy, just do it, because we want the very best. But remember, DDR5 is still within conventional memory space. It's still catering to, your average application, your computers, your phones, the non-AI servers. To cater to those markets, you require volume, because they're not for rockets or AI or sending a satellites. These are for the average civil applications. So it makes no sense for Beijing to spend a lot of money for them to flood the market and supplying to smartphones and PCs. And this is why we don't think the disruption potentially the Chinese players can bring to DDR5 is a near-term risk because it makes no sense for the Chinese players and also for Beijing government to do that for now.
Got it. What's your thoughts on the valuation of the stock?
Yeah, so right now the stock trades like 9 times earnings for forward, 1.5 times like price to book, 6 times like free cash flow. So if you look at from a conventional like valuation metrics like PE or free cash flow, 6 times free cash flow, 9 times earnings, it's very, very modest valuation versus a lot of the AI names out there.
Sure.
Now, obviously, the conventional side of the business is very cyclical. So typically we will use a price to book approach to evaluate the business because obviously when during the downturn when they're losing money, there's no earnings. So the PE ratio looks like pretty funny. Historically, forget about the structural grower, which is the HBM business catered to AI. The conventional business typically trades between 1 to 2 times PB. So 1.5, you would say that's reasonable. It's basically in the middle of the road. That's like through the cycle, quote unquote, fair valuation. But again, what's changed really the new business, which carries much higher pricing. The pricing is roughly 5 to 10x per unit versus conventional memory. It carries a lot higher profitability. Their peak conventional memory side, the gross margin roughly 40 to 45%. They don't disclose on the HBM side the gross margin, but we think, and looking at the Hynix and Samsung, we think the gross margin is a lot higher, probably like over 60%, close to 70%. It's a lot higher. So, and remember, the business is still growing very fast. A year ago, Micron pretty much has nothing. And this year, going to 25, they're probably going to do close to 5 billion. So basically from nothing to 5 billion. It's growing very fast. So we think this business deserves a much higher valuation. Now, remember, this year, Micron probably do top line call like 30 to 35 billion. So if they get to 5-6 billion of high bandwidth memory business this year, that's really like a mid-teen percentage of the total revenue pie. And because the margin a lot higher, if you look at the profit or operating profit, the percentage go a lot higher. So we think that business is a much higher multiple. So as a combined business, that trades at 1.5 times book, we think there's definitely more upside there for sure.
You've talked about how the industry's become much more rational now that there's fewer players involved. If the industry has become truly more rational, how come the stocks haven't re-rated? What would it take for the valuation to re-rate? Why does it continue to remain in the traditional side, deeply cyclical, therefore it trades at such multiples?
So let's break down, right? It goes back to the investor debate. So I would say the bears still do not believe that the industry has become more rational. They say, hey, look, yes, we have a little bit upturn from end of 2023 through 24. Now we're going to massive down cycle again because the industry has not changed. The Chinese guy will flood DDR5. It's going to show up this year. They don't believe the inventory correction on the consumer PC and smartphone side will end by spring of this year. So people are still very bearish. They need to see that the inventory correction will end by spring 2025, and then the view will change. And we're betting on that as well, because as we know, the spring 2025 will come. Even for smartphones, conventional side, iPhone gonna release their new iPhone 17 in September, but they will still manufacturing that in spring of this year to prepare for the inventory. Remember, per phone, for iPhone, the memory content is going from 8 gigabytes to 12 gigabytes. So per phone content, the memory content is going up 50%. Even if the total volume stayed flat, assuming there's no growth, zero growth, but the per phone content, that's like 50% upside there. Same applies to all the Android phones, which is starting ramping the production in spring 2025. So, we'll see when we come to spring, we'll see. But the bears will need to see the data inflecting higher to believe that, okay, now the industry is indeed more rational. So that's the conventional side. AI side, I would say people are still very worried about when Samsung gets into space, will that destroy pricing? Even though Micron and Hynix both said, we're already locked in our pricing for the entire year in 2025 against our biggest clients, NVIDIA, AMD, and now Google becoming the third client. In 26, the pricing will continue to move higher. bears are not believing that. Bears will say, hey, look, once Samsung gets in, even though you say you locked in price with NVIDIA, AMD this year, no, they're going to come back to the table and renegotiate. You're going to have to cut your price. So the bears are not believing that. They need to see when Samsung qualifies, gets in supply chain, but the demand is still far higher than the supply, which means the pricing can stay high for the rest of the year for them to change their mind. So I would say those are probably the two signposts that the bears are watching, or the board watching, to change their mind.
Yeah. I mean, if I understand that they've locked in the price, but why would, if a third competitor were to enter, long term, why wouldn't that cause prices to
because supply, because supply is still very small, even though everybody's like both both Hynix and Micron are ramping up the capacity. And the reasons that like in the ideal world, they definitely want to have like 2x their capacity versus what they have right now. The bottleneck is not on Micron or in Hynix. So, Hynix and Micron are both converting their conventional DRAM production line to HBM, right? Because they can make a lot higher money here. So they're doing that. The bottlenecks really their equipment suppliers. So, key bottlenecks, the bonders offered by Tokyo Electron, which is an equipment supplier in Japan. And they could not get enough equipment from the suppliers. And we asked the suppliers, like, why don't you manufacture more? And the answer is like, they have a long production cycle. And they're very cautious because it's like, look, we're far away from the end demand. We don't know if the AI thing is real. We don't know if the HBM market will stay bullish for the next 5 years. So, we want to be cautious. So we want to manufacture too much. Like we, Tokyo Electron equipment supplier, we do not want to expand our capacity to manufacture more equipment, which goes to Micron and Samsung and Hynix, even though they tell us they need more. So that's a huge bottleneck there because their equipment suppliers are not willing to increase capex to manufacture more equipment. And this is why, even though Micron and Hynix say, hey, look, we can convert our production line to HBM from conventional, we're still waiting for our suppliers to supply more equipment. The flip side of that is that that's actually good for industry pricing because the supply will be constrained, even if the three players all want to push increase in supply because their suppliers, equipment players, are not wanting to play that game.
Got it. What would you have to see to turn very bearish on the stock?
So on conventional side, it definitely is that the Chinese, they don't care. They're gonna use 28 nanometer process to push out DDR5. They don't care about the prices. Like they can lose a lot of money. They're gonna still continue to push it to phone, to PC market. So they gain material market share and really just keep the pricing low. So that's the conventional side. On the AM memory side, it's really about Samsung comes in and Samsung said, yes, supply is still constrained. The demand is still 50% higher than supply, but to show our commitment to NVIDIA or our client, we're going to cut our price by 50%. And NVIDIA comes back to Hynix and Micron say, hey, look, we know we signed a contract with you, but Samsung said they're going to cut the price by 50%. Let's negotiate. So those will be the risks for a conventional side on the AI memory side. Yeah,
those definitely seem like important risks to be watching. Okay, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much. That was super helpful.
Thank you, Dan, for having us.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.